Today's speaker is Dr. Dominique Estival, who is a researcher at Marks Institute, Western Sydney University. Across her career, she has worked in both academia and industry. As a linguist, her research is interested in areas like computational modelling of language change, machine translation, linguistic engineering, spoken dialogue systems, and aviation communication. As a pilot and flight instructor, she is interested in improving pilot training to prevent miscommunication. Thank you very much for that. Okay, so I hand over to Dr. Dominique Estival.
Okay, thank you very much, Jamie. First, and to Professor Eric Friginal for inviting me to give this talk. I'm just trying to manipulate my screens here, so I hope I don't look like I'm completely lost. So I first want to thank my colleagues. I've got the names on the slides. So first, Brett Molesworth. I've been collaborating with Brett for many years, and the data for the study that I'm going to be talking about was collected as part of our joint project, and it was recently published. Malila Prado and Nariko Ishihara, with whom I've been working on a close analysis of a communication incident, and I will talk about that one. And that was presented at the 9th GIA seminar and hopefully will be published soon as well. Now, that study that I did with Malila and Noriko led me to refine the notion of politeness markers that I'm using in the study that I'll be presenting today. It's actually not really completely refined, this notion, and I will be very pleased to get comments and suggestions on how to actually specify it better. And finally, Stuart Fitzpatrick is a PhD student in data science at Western Sydney University, and he did the analysis that I will be presenting. So, aviation language, okay? So I don't know how many people in this audience actually know about aviation language, but I will be talking about it a little bit more in detail. But most people know that pilots and air traffic controllers talk to each other over the radio in a language which is quite controlled, and that we need to avoid confusion and ambiguity. And many people will have heard the word negative and affirm or affirmative when watching movies about aviation. So the outline of my talk today is, first I'm going to be talking about aviation language. Then I will describe briefly the mandate by the International Civil Aviation Organization, which I will say ICAO. And then communication problems that we still have with native English speakers and non-native English speakers. The Narita incidents that I mentioned, and that will lead me to talk about deviations from phraseology and verbosity. And then I'll move on to the LiveATC studies. So LiveATC is a website or an application, if you want, where you can get recordings from live air traffic controller communications around the world. And this is a couple of studies that we've done, and I will try to extract the context and factors for politeness markers, and then some implications from those studies. So yes, as Jamie said, if there are any questions, please put them in the chat, and maybe Jamie then can relay them to me, especially if there are things that are not clear, that I go too fast or I haven't explained enough. I can, take a few seconds to stop and explain things. I'd rather have people understand what I'm talking about rather than talking in the void. So aviation communication. Well, as I said, aviation communication is really conducted in a code which is based on English, but is strictly constrained to prevent vagueness when a meaning is unclear, ambiguities when a word can have different meanings, and confusions between different words. So for instance, in the cartoon that we saw, negative and affirmative can be confused because they can sound the same. This is very important over the radio because unlike the telephone, radio is single channel. That means only one person can speak at a time. And that makes communication even harder. There are many people competing for time on the frequency to convey a lot of information. So information has to be conveyed very concisely, and there is only one speaker at a time. So the phraseology, standard phraseology has been defined or prescribed with a very limited vocabulary and set phrases, but also from the point of view of pragmatics, how to take turns on the radio. That is not the way you talk normally. We start with our call sign, we finish with a call sign to indicate that we have finished talking, and very specific pronunciations which are not general English. So for instance, the sound th in English is very hard to understand over the radio, and it's also a very difficult sound for people for whom English is not a native language. So in aviation, we don't say three, we say tree. We don't say thousand, we say thousand. And it's really important for safety, for aviation safety, that people adhere to these conventions, to these prescriptions, because any confusion or wrong interpretation can be deadly. For instance, a very famous accident is the one in 1996 over the village of Sharki Dadri, which is just outside of Delhi, between a Kazakhstan airline with a Russian pilot and a Saudi Arabia airline with a Saudi pilot. And the air traffic controller was Indian. There was miscommunication, misunderstanding, mid-air collision, and 351 people died. As a result, India asked the International Civil Aviation Organization to make it more prescribed to have language proficiency requirements for operations and for professional pilots and air traffic controllers. And so in 2008, there was this mandate that all new pilots and air traffic controller personnel, ATC, are required to pass an English language proficiency test. Now, this was actually prescribed in 2008, in 2003. It became effective in 2008. Many countries could not meet the deadline, and it was extended to 2011. But in Australia, it was 2008. And that brings me to my own background, which is that, as Jamie mentioned, I'm a linguist. Actually, I did a PhD in syntax. And I'm also a pilot, and I've been flying for many years for fun because I love flying. And in 2009, I became a flight instructor, and I've been working as a flight instructor part-time since then. At the same time, so the new regulations came in force, and I decided to combine my two interests, my two loves, aviation and linguistics, and I started research on aviation language. So my context is the training, flight training, but also language training of native English speakers and non-native English speakers. So what can go wrong? Okay, well, we've seen one example. I'll get to one example. But in general aviation, it's also a problem. So general aviation is aviation which is not for either not military and not airlines. So we had a student at Bankstown, which is the airfield where I fly. And one thing to know is that Australia has a big industry of overseas pilots learning to fly in Australia because we've got such wonderful weather. It's a great place to learn to fly. The student had passed the English language proficiency, but the control tower refused to have him go solo in the circuit. And the reason they gave is that they could not understand the student, and the student was unable to respond. So the problems in miscommunication is for non-native English speakers, the problem may be that pronunciation is influenced by the L1. By the way, my L1 is French. I'm French originally, so I'm not a native speaker of English. Lack of fluency and low comprehension. But native English speakers also can cause problems. And in particular, they can be tempted to fall back on conversational English. And that's well documented. I'm not the first person to say it. And it's more widely recognized. It has been more widely recognized recently that native English speakers may be tempted to see English, aviation English, as being their language. And so they fall back on general English. And indeed, when there is no phraseology for a particular situation, ICAO says we can use what's called plain English to be used when there is no available phraseology. But it's not general English, it's not conversational English. The regulations say it must still be concise, precise, not ambiguous, and it must follow the rules of radio telephony as closely as possible. And it should only be used when there is no phraseology available. So another problem for miscommunication is when information is actually masked. So for instance, there is extra words or a noisy channel that will lead to unintelligibility. And this is where we're going to see whether the technology works. Okay, so this is the incident that I mentioned not too long ago, in July 2021. And a flight, national cargo, so a cargo flight from Tokyo, Narita, going to Seoul in South Korea, reported a fire incident in a cargo compartment during the climb out at about 27,000 feet. So fortunately, the incident ended with the successful return to Narita. But unfortunately, the communication between the pilots and the air traffic controllers was so problematic that the recording of the incident was posted on YouTube. And there were many comments regarding the inadequacy of the pilot's phraseology, as well as the strong accent of one of the Japanese air traffic controllers. So this prompted me to further analyze this incident, and that's what we did with Malila Prado and Noriko Ishihara. So here here's a short sample of the interaction, the beginning, where we see the contrast between them. So, oops, sorry, I've lost my mouse.
National Cargo 891, declared exit Sapra, Sierra, Alpha, Papa, Romeo, Alpha, Sapra.
Direct Sapra, that's Cargo 891, Arigatou gozaimashita. And ATC National Cargo 891, we got a fire cargo aft boarding. We'd like to vector back to Narita.
National Cargo 891, say it again, please.
Can you give us a vector back to Narita at this time?
National Cargo 891, say again.
Okay, so this goes on for way too long, and it takes them several minutes before they actually get themselves understood and they come back. I like this incident because actually it ends well, but also there are a number of problems in it. So I'll skip some of the details of the analysis because you can find that in what Malila and Noriko have written and I have written. But the important thing is that although many of the YouTube comments heavily criticize the first Japanese air traffic controller for a strong accent, and we can't deny that, it's actually the pilot transmissions that are not understood. The pilots, in fact, understand almost all of what ATC said. There were only two air traffic controller transmissions that are not completely understood. One is a term that we analyze very closely, and one is inaudible. The audio is not audible. So, well, I won't go through them. So to analyze the data, we followed the methodology that Brett Molesworth, started with our data in the flight simulator data a number of years ago, and that we had used with Chong Wu. And I'll get to that data, but we divide a transcript into turns and information items, and we code deviation from expected transmissions in standard phraseology. So we get professional pilots, not just me, but commercial pilots and other flight instructors to give us the transmissions that would be expected in standard phraseology, and then we code deviations, either as incorrect for words that convey the intended meaning but do not conform to the phraseology. For instance, 16 should be 16. Omitted is for words that should have been included but did not. For instance, Mayday, the pilot should have said Mayday and they did not. And for this particular study, and I'll get to why I did that, we added the category additional and divided it into extraneous, which is content that's irrelevant, unnecessary, and relational for contents that is words that do not add content, but is aimed to establish the relationship. So we could call those politeness markers. For instance, we'd like in the transmission that we heard. So for example, in turn 10, can you give us a vector back to Narita at this time? In red, we have the actual transmission by the pilot, and we can see the additional words, can you give us, which we coded as relational because it could also be called a politeness marker. And at this time, which doesn't add anything, but which makes the transmission longer. Meanwhile, we can see that in blue, there is the expected transmission, request vectors to Narita. And the word request, which is the most important word, is missing. And so is the call sign, which is not so important. But that's basically 5 errors, excuse me, 4 errors in this transmission. When we look at the distribution of deviations, we see that 25 of them occurred in the transmissions that were not or only partially understood. So I'll give you the average here, and you can see that there are almost 10 times as many deviations in the pilot transmissions than in the ATC transmission. And we can see that in the transmission that were only partially understood or not understood, the average is even higher, 1.8. So this shows the strong negative impact of deviations from phraseology on understanding, comprehension in the context of aviation. Then I noted that the 2 transmissions that were only partially understood, which I have on the screen here, were particularly verbose. So I counted the additional words in the deviations. You can see that here we got many, many additional words, and in red are all the deviations from what is expected. So in the 118 transmissions, we find that there is a total of 161 additional words, and many more for the pilots than for the air traffic controllers. And again, interestingly, we have a much greater average of additional words in the transmissions that were not or only partially understood than in the other transmissions. So again, that shows vividly the negative impact of verbosity on aviation communication. For the deviations that we found, all the pilots and the air traffic controllers that we interviewed for our study, and many of the YouTube comments actually, pointed out that the crucial errors in the transmissions that were not understood were the standard phraseology phrases that were missing. So the phrases to convey an emergency, Mayday, and the phrases to request a return to Narita Airport, request, which are words that have to be present in the transmissions, and all the non-standard phrases that were used instead. So in addition to the conversational words that the pilots use to convey the meaning of mayday and request, which we have here with declaring an emergency, with like vectors. The pilots also used incorrect words that are specifically disallowed by the standard phraseology. For instance, the preposition for is forbidden in front of numbers because it's confusable with the number 4. So if I say 4,000 feet, it sounds like it's 4. And the word yes is not allowed, and neither is the word no, because they're so short that over the radio they can be confused and they're not, you can't hear them. So for the additional words that were found in the transmissions, some of them are unnecessary, but they fall into what we call the relational category. So there are words that are intended to help the interaction, and others only add unnecessary information. Now, in the case of we're declaring an emergency, these words were clearly intended to convey an important information. So I couldn't categorize them as extraneous, and they were labeled as relational. So maybe this is one example of where we need to further develop the taxonomy and have a better label for what we've categorized as additional relational and additional extraneous. And I would be very happy if anybody had suggestions on how to improve this analysis. So the deviations from standard phraseology, as I said, are tolerated to a certain extent. Plain English is to be used when there are no phraseology in certain situations. And an important question is how much deviation is necessary, and whether some deviations could be not only tolerated, but also included in the phraseology. And in particular, a type of deviation which occurs in routine situations is the use of politeness markers. So good day, thank you. In general conversation, politeness markers can be argued to be useful because they help smooth interactions. They create better relations between the interlocutors. And it's been suggested that that's also the case in aviation communication. So in spite of the strict constraints limiting the vocabulary, we do find politeness markers to help smooth the interaction between air traffic controllers and pilots. And it's been noted by several researchers because they do create better relations. I mean, as a pilot myself, I can attest to the fact that, especially when you fly in the same place regularly, we do build a rapport with the air traffic controller, and you do say thank you at the end and good day to show that you recognize the voice of the person and that you acknowledge that this is somebody that you interact with regularly, or you appreciate the help that they've given you at a particular moment. And of course, because there are not that many female pilots, there are not that many female pilots with a French accent flying around Sydney. And so, yes, the air traffic controllers recognize who I am, and it makes sense to build on that recognition. However, plain English, as I said, is not conversational English. It still must be concise, precise, non-ambiguous, and it should only be used when there is no phraseology available. And it's not the case that politeness markers will be positive always, because any additional word increases the length of the speech signal, and it may make it more difficult for the recipient to identify the important words that need to be attended to. So as we saw, verbosity is detrimental, it decreases intelligibility, and when you have too many extra words in one transmission, the important ones may not stand out. The Japanese air traffic controller did not recognize the phrase vector back to Narita. And I would argue it's because there were so many extra words around those that she couldn't extract them. She couldn't extract the important information out of the speech signal. And I would say there was no need for all the extraneous words in the pilot transmissions during the Narita incident. Even the relational we'd like or can you give us could have contributed and probably did contribute to the Japanese air traffic controller not understanding the message. Clarity and lack of ambiguity, which is the aim of phraseology, are particularly necessary when the interlocutors do not share the same language background. But I'm sure you've noticed, what about arigato gozaimashita? That was kind of a nice touch from the pilot, and that didn't detract from the understanding in the conversation. So in fact, another researcher, Hansen Shira, in her study of code switching in ATC pilot communication at international airport, she found that when it comes to oral conversations, interactants tend to use phrases of politeness and greetings, and that the lack of politeness might cause problems in intercultural communication, which in turn might lead to non-communication. So there's an argument that we should have politeness markers, that it does help. And interestingly, she also found that 10% of the code switching, she found code switching in 10% of utterances at Paris. And typically there were phrases of politeness such as bonjour. And at Amsterdam Schiphol, Dutch is only used for greeting formulas. So no code switching is only for greetings. So there is something to be said for using greetings and politeness markers, and maybe even using them in the different language, the language of the ground. My question, and that's where my study, or what I'm trying to find out, is how much politeness should be encouraged and how much variation can be tolerated. And in order to do that, I'll turn to our other study, which is using the LiveATC data. So the analysis of the Narita incident is just one incident. And of course, it's difficult to make generalizations from just one incident. And we had started this study with Brett Molesworth of LiveATC data. We started in 2018 with recordings, 18 hours of recordings at Sydney Airport. And we published this in 2019. There, the point of the study was to find out what type of error and category of error native English speakers and non-native English speakers make, because we cannot know for sure, because we cannot ask them what their native language is. We had to categorize the pilots into native English soundings, or more cautious, and accented pilots. And I can go through the details of that if that interests you. But the point was that actually native English speakers did not make many mistakes, but accented pilots did not make many mistakes either. And in terms of the mistakes that really are important, would be important and catastrophic in the aviation environment, they made no mistakes with numbers and only omissions. Okay, so that was our early study where we refined the methodology used to code the data, and we categorized the pilots into NES and accented. Our latest study is with a larger data set. We have 250 transmissions from 4 international airports. So again, Sydney, but also Los Angeles, Hong Kong, and Tokyo in not Narita, Haneda. I hope I won't get them confused. And we had 3 research questions, and one of them was actually, I was interested in whether politeness markers would affect communication, whether there would be more communication errors in the transmissions that contain the politeness markers. What we found is that that was not the case. And another question that we asked was whether the alignment of speakers reduced communication errors. That had been found to be the case at Bangkok, that when both the air traffic controllers and the pilots were Thai speaking, there were fewer errors than when the air traffic controller and the pilot did not share native language. What we found in our study, which was for 2 English-speaking airports and 2 where English is not the native language, although of course that's debatable for Hong Kong, is that what we have is that more errors when one speaker is the native English speaker. So at Sydney and Los Angeles, when ATC is speaking to a non-English speaking pilot, and at Hong Kong and Haneda, when the air traffic controllers are speaking to pilots who are native English sounding. So that was a very interesting result. But the question is, the politeness markers did not affect communication in that study, but what we had looked at was the occurrence of a politeness marker and communication errors in the same transmission. So that's what we published. So that's the paper we published. But while I was coding the data and working on the analysis, I actually noticed that politeness markers tended to occur in longer interactions between pilots and ATC, or in interactions where something unusual had occurred. So I started this new project with Stuart Fitzpatrick, where we looked at the data and recoded all the politeness markers, all the data with the politeness markers, and looked at longer interactions and interactions where something unusual had happened. So I'll give you a couple of examples. So a longer interaction where there is an unexpected instruction. So this is an operational situation. So this is an example of a complete conversation at Los Angeles, and there is an unexpected warning by the air traffic controller about traffic in utterance 48. And that led to several additional transmissions. And very unusually, at the end of the conversation, both interlocutors finish with good day, and ATC even repeats good day. And it is unusual because there are not that many politeness markers in the data. So it's noticeable that these occur in an interaction which is where something out of the ordinary happened. And when I say out of the ordinary, it's not a serious situation. It's just that it's not just the standard instruction, read back instruction that we have normally. So that was one interaction, and another interaction where we have an unusual closing of good day, bye, and thanks. In this case, again, it's a complete interaction at Los Angeles between Singapore 12 and in blue at line 17, we have the pilot requesting confirmation of their understanding of the ambiguous instruction. So when ATC at line 15 says 160, that could be interpreted as a heading or a change of speed to 160 knots. And first the pilot responds, right, heading 160, and then he thinks about it and he thinks, oh, I just want to make sure that my interpretation was correct. And that leads to extra transmissions. And at the end, we have the pilot reading back an incorrect frequency. So the frequency was 133.9, and the pilot reads back 123.9, and the air traffic controller says 133.9, and the pilot then corrects and says 133.9. So it's a small thing, but it's enough for them to then complete the exchange by having this series of good day, goodbye, and thanks. So that was the hypothesis that we would find more of those markers in interactions that were longer or in which something had happened, not just in transmissions in which there was an error. So that's what we did. And so we first looked at, I'm giving you the number of transmissions at each location. Yes, those codes, YSSY, VHH, they're the international codes for the airports. And so we've got the total number of transmissions from pilots and ATC. And a transmission is defined as a single utterance by one speaker, pilot or ATC, which is bounded by a transmission from another speaker or by silence. And transmissions are always identified by the call sign of the aircraft. The number of politeness markers at each location. So first, the number of conversations that we have at each location, and the number of conversations in which there was at least one politeness markers, and whether the politeness marker was uttered by the pilot or the ATC. I should mention that the number of conversations tells you how many pilots there were in the data, and that there were 2 air traffic controllers at Los Angeles. So the question about sharing a language background between pilots and air traffic controllers, basically, as I said, we didn't expect whether it would go one way or the other, because you could expect that if people don't share a language, then they will be more polite towards each other. But also, you could say if people share a language, then they're more comfortable and they will use more relaxed and conversational speech. So we did not expect that it would go one way or the other. And what we found is that actually there was no effect for sharing the language background. Conversation length. Okay, the important thing to take away from that table is that in bold, the standard is to show in bold significant results. So the conversation length and number of politeness markers, the correlation is positive at all locations except Hong Kong. And that is interesting in itself. I don't have an explanation, but there is a factor that could explain why that is the case. So this apparent exception is that at Hong Kong, what we found is that most politeness markers occur in pairs. So that graph made a bit confusing, maybe. I don't know if you can see my mouse, but at Hong Kong, the politeness markers occur in the column, which is 2. At the other 3 locations, we get many more ones, so 1 politeness marker per conversation, and then a spread. But at Hong Kong, usually there is 1 politeness marker as a greeting in the first transmission in the conversation, and then another politeness marker at the end of the last transmission in that conversation, just the way you would in a normal conversation. And so pairs of politeness markers are so common at Hong Kong in our data that there is no relationship that we can find between the number of transmissions and the number of politeness markers. So that's the only thing I can say about this, because I don't have an interpretation really about why that would be the case. Now, when it comes to communication errors in the conversation, so earlier in the conversation, as in the examples I showed, we again find that there is a correlation at all locations except at Hong Kong. And as I just mentioned, conversations at Hong Kong usually contain pairs of politeness markers, and that might mask any other effect. So we cannot draw any conclusion from that. So the conclusion is that in general, there are more communication, more politeness markers in conversations where there were communication errors. Finally, this is the table of all of the politeness markers that we found in our data, in our LiveATC data. And what I want to take away from this is the very different type to token ratio at the 4 locations. So whereas at Sydney and Los Angeles, which are the native English speaker locations, there is a very limited, a more limited number of types, a number of kinds of politeness markers, basically bye, good afternoon, have a good day, thank you. Sorry, I just said the opposite of what I wanted to say, excuse me. So at Sydney and Los Angeles, there is a much greater variety, a greater range of types, and many, many more tokens as well. We can see that at Hong Kong and at Haneda, the air traffic controllers and the pilots use a much more limited range of politeness markers. So, just to recap, in Sydney, you get 10 types and 63 tokens. At Los Angeles, 11 types, 31 tokens. But at Haneda, 6 types and 10 tokens. And at Hong Kong, 8 types, 19 tokens. So what I want to do with this is to potentially extract a subset that would be useful to teach non-native English speakers so that they can recognize them and use them appropriately. And also to teach native English speakers that they don't really need all of these variations. They're trying to say a very limited number of things, of expressing what I call relational communication effects. And they don't need to have so many different words to express those relations. So the implication of this study, I think, are important, not only for aviation training, which is the kind of thing that I do and a lot of other people do, but also for the implementation of the recommendations of the International Civil Aviation Organization globally. The ICAO does recommend that native English speakers try to avoid slang or familiar language when they talk to non-native English speakers, but there is no requirement that native English speakers be tested on their communication skills. So in the Narita incident, yeah, the strong accent of the Japanese air traffic controller makes it hard to understand her, but it was not the cause of the miscommunication. I would contend that if the pilots had used standard phraseology and the recommended communicative strategies to accommodate her, instead of expecting to be understood by her when using conversational English, they would have been able to convey their predicaments much quicker. The implementation of those recommendations should be applied even in English-speaking countries, and that is not the case in all English-speaking countries. Native English speakers are not tested in aviation communication proficiency, And language proficiency requirements should cover not only standard phraseology but also turn-taking, pronunciation, and the pragmatic strategies to make yourself understood. And they should not be just language proficiency as we understand as linguists when we talk about training second language. And that leads me to my next set of conclusions, which is that there is an inherent contradiction in the current ICAO training and testing, recommendations for training and testing of pilots and air traffic controllers. Because the goal for most people is to get the level 6, ICAO level 6, which is expert speaker, which is equivalent to native English speaker, and that's what people want. Most of the students that I have who are not native English speakers, they try to acquire what is being tested on level 6, which is fluency, varied vocabulary, command of idioms. The question is, are these actually necessary for international safe operations? Especially when we say that the level 4, which does not require such varied vocabulary and command of idioms, is deemed adequate for professional operations. So the Japanese air traffic controller in the Narita incident, most certainly, I mean, that's 100% sure, had at least a level 4. But obviously her understanding of fluent English and conversational English was not as good as the native English speakers pilots were hoping. So how much variation should we aim for? I would say we should focus on successful communication and not on testing aspects of the language, such as level of fluency and vocabulary and idioms. And we should teach a subset of those politeness markers to non-native English speakers and teach them when it's appropriate to use them. And very importantly, teach native English speakers to limit their variation and teach them communication strategies. So I leave you with the next cartoon, which shows how native English speakers can express agreement in many different ways, which would not be appropriate over the radio. So thank you. These are some of the references that I would be happy to share with you, and I will be happy to take questions now.